She washed ashore with no name, no plan, just the weight of a child growing inside her, and the shadow of a man who wanted her erased. He had given up on saving anyone, even himself, until that morning, when the tide brought her to his doorstep, like a question the universe demanded he answer. What began with a rescue on the Oregon coast would become something no court, no money, and no past could ever predict, a legacy rewritten not with power, but with love. This isn't just a story about survival. It's about a woman who rose from silence, a man who chose to stay, and a child whose first breath ignited a revolution of healing. Before we begin, if stories about strength, redemption, and the quiet power of kindness resonate with you, subscribe, share, and take a deep breath. You're about to witness a transformation. The wind was different that morning, saltier, heavier, like the breath of the sea held something it had been meaning to release. Along the gray-misted coastline of Oregon, where pine trees stood like solemn sentinels and the waves rolled in, not with fury, but with quiet insistence, a man named Micah Turner stood at the edge of the dunes, with his hands deep in the worn pockets of a wool jacket older than most promises. His eyes, storm-colored and half-shadowed by a battered cap, stared out at the tide with the blank practiced stillness of someone who no longer expected the world to surprise him. Behind him, crouched in the wet sand with knees smudged and lips pursed in silent focus, was a boy of 12 named Eli, arranging clamshells in a perfect spiral that made sense only to him. They didn't speak, not out of distance, but of rhythm. Their mornings always began like this, before the tourists came, before the sun dared cut through the low-hanging mist. Micah liked it that way, clean, predictable, the kind of silence that didn't demand anything but your presence. But today the silence broke not with words, but with a sudden stillness from the boy. Eli froze, his small hand hovering over a blue speckled shell, his head turning toward the water, like he'd heard a sound no one else could. Micah followed the boy's gaze, eyes narrowing as the surf pushed something unfamiliar ashore. At first it looked like driftwood tangled in kelp, a branch maybe, or a collapsed sail. But then he saw it, a pale arm outstretched toward the sky, fingers curled like a question. Micah didn't think. His body moved with the instinct of someone who had once known how to save, but had long since stopped believing he could. "Stay here," he said sharply, boots slamming against wet sand as he ran. The figure was face down, half buried in seaweed, long dark hair floating in ribbons like ink in water. He turned her gently, water spilling from her clothing. Her skin was ghost-white, lips tinged blue, and her stomach, my God, was swollen with life. She was pregnant. He pressed trembling fingers to her neck. A pulse, weak but there. Without a second thought, Micah lifted her into his arms, the coldness of her body seeping into his own. The weight of her wasn't just from her condition or soaked clothing, it was the weight of something else, something broken. He trudged through the wet sand, each step heavier than the last, until Eli came into view again. Blankets. Now Micah barked, and the boy sprinted toward the weather-beaten pickup truck parked along the trailhead. Micah knelt in the sand, cradling the stranger against his chest, her breath shallow but steadying. Her eyelids flickered, lips parting like she might speak, but no sound came, only a whimper, a tear tracking down her frozen cheek. "I've got you," Micah whispered, shocked by the softness in his own voice. "You're safe now." The ride back to the cabin was quiet except for the click of Eli's worry beads in the back seat, and the distant groan of waves still rolling in behind them. She was wrapped in every blanket they had, her head tilted toward the cracked window, as if listening for something only she could hear. Micah didn't ask questions. Not yet. He just drove, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, heart pounding in a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. By the time they reached the cabin, the fire was already lit, courtesy of Eli's unspoken understanding. The room smelled of pine smoke and old wool. Micah laid her gently on the pull-out couch near the hearth, brushing damp strands of hair from her forehead. Her eyes fluttered open again, glassy and confused. "What's your name?" he asked softly.
Her lips moved, a rasp, barely above breath. "Naomi! Naomi Blake." He repeated it as if sealing it into memory. "I'm Micah. That's Eli. You washed up on the beach. Do you remember what happened?" She blinked slowly, then her hand drifted to her belly like a compass returning north. Her voice, hoarse and trembling, broke the stillness. They pushed me. 3 words. But they dropped into the room like thunder. Micah stilled. "Who?" he asked quietly.
Her eyes wide with terror locked onto his as her hand gripped his wrist with unexpected strength. "Please, don't let them find me." He looked at Eli, who stood quietly in the corner, unreadable but present. And in the silence that followed, Micah made a decision not spoken but absolute. "You're safe here," he said, with a weight behind the words that sounded like more than a promise. "Whoever they are, they won't get through me." And though he didn't know it yet, those words would become the line he'd draw in the sand. Because the tide hadn't just brought Naomi to shore, it had brought a reckoning. And for the first time in a very long while, Micah Turner wasn't just a man watching the waves. He was standing against them. The cabin creaked softly as the storm clouds rolled in from the Pacific, not yet spilling their burden, but making their presence known in the hush between wind gusts and the rustle of pine. Naomi lay curled beneath 3 layers of blankets, her skin still cold, lips chapped, and eyes flickering beneath closed lids, as if her body refused to surrender fully to rest. Micah sat nearby in a rocking chair that groaned with each gentle sway, his calloused hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee, gone lukewarm hours ago. Eli was sprawled on the braided rug near the hearth, flipping through a weathered book, without truly reading, his eyes drifting occasionally toward Naomi, as if trying to decipher the puzzle of this woman who had risen from the sea like some half-drowned myth. Outside, the sky darkened and the tide pulled further back, as though giving them space to breathe. Micah couldn't stop replaying the words in his head. "They pushed me." The raw panic in her voice, the way her fingers had gripped him with desperation, and something deeper, something ancient like the last thread tying her to life. He hadn't asked again, not yet. She needed warmth, stability, and time before she could face whatever horror had placed her in the water that morning. But inside, his instincts had already begun to calculate where could she hide, who would come, and how far would they go to finish what they started. He stood walking to the woodpile stacked near the stove, feeding logs into the fire with slow deliberation. Sparks hissed upward and the heat bloomed, filling the room with comfort that barely touched the chill he felt under his skin. Naomi stirred, murmuring something inaudible, before her eyes opened, slowly disoriented. She blinked at the fire, then at Micah, and then at Eli, who offered a small wave without a word. Where am I?" she whispered. "Cabin off Grayshore Trail." Micah said, voice low but steady, "You washed up on the beach near my property. We brought you here." Her brow furrowed and her hand instinctively covered her belly. The baby heart beat strong, Micah reassured her. "I checked for what I could. Called a nurse I know from the village. She talked me through it." Naomi's shoulders sank in something close to relief, but her eyes remained guarded. "I don't know what to do," she said. "You don't have to know yet," he replied. "You just have to rest." She nodded faintly and looked away, her gaze fixed on the fire. Hours passed. The wind outside gathered force, rattling the windows in their frames. Naomi's breathing deepened, and finally she slept. Micah sat across the room, pretending not to watch her, but he was. Every twitch of her hand, every shift of her body, he noted it all. She was still afraid. It lived in the way she kept one foot tucked beneath her, as if ready to flee, in the way her fingers curled, as though bracing for another push. And Micah knew something then, with complete clarity. She wasn't just running from someone, she was running from somewhere that had never given her peace. That night, after Eli had gone to bed and the fire dimmed to a warm glow, Naomi asked, "Do you believe in fate?" Micah didn't answer immediately. He ran his fingers along the edge of the coffee table, tracing the grain. "I used to believe in current," he said. "How it pulls you, carries you, sometimes drowns you, but sometimes it washes things ashore, things that need saving." Naomi was silent for a long time. Then she whispered, "I used to believe I could fix things. My marriage, my silence, my image. Garrett. He's not just cruel, he's powerful, controlled. Everything about our life was staged. Even the apology that led to that damn boat trip." Micah's hands tensed. He apologized. "After I filed a restraining order and withdrew it the next week," she said bitterly. "He said he wanted to talk, said he was sorry. Booked the yacht, told me we needed to reset. I thought, maybe." She laughed dry and hollow. "But instead of dinner, I got a shove. And no one saw," Micah asked. "Crew was dismissed early. Said we'd dock ourselves, but he had someone with him, a man. I didn't see his face. I think he was the one who closed the hatch so no one could hear me scream." Her voice cracked. And then I was in the water. Micah swallowed hard. Did he know you were pregnant? Yes. He didn't want the baby. Said I was trying to trap him. But I didn't even know I was until after I left. That's why I went back to talk. I had all the files evidence of his abuse bank transfers, screenshots of his threats. I had it all in my bag. She suddenly gasped. My bag wasn't with you, Micah said. Nothing washed ashore but you. She buried her face in her hands. Then it's gone. Maybe not, Micah said. Depends on how much tide buried. I'll check in the morning. Naomi lowered her hands and stared into the fire. You don't even know me. Why are you helping? Micah leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Because someone once helped me. Because I know what it's like to be pulled from something dark and have to decide if you want to live. And did you? Eventually, he said. But it took time. And it took someone who didn't give up on me when I had. Naomi said nothing but her eyes. Eyes rimmed red with exhaustion, and Salt held his gaze longer than she had looked at anyone in years. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was heavy with understanding. The next morning, the ocean had retreated, revealing trails of driftwood and seaweed. Micah rose early, leaving Naomi and Eli asleep inside. He searched the shore methodically, boots squelching in the wet sand eyes, scanning for anything that might resemble her lost bag. He didn't find it, but he found something else, a broken necklace tangled in seagrass, the silver chain gleaming faintly in the morning sun. He recognized the seashell charm from the photo Naomi had shown him the night before. It must have snapped off during the struggle. He pocketed it, unsure if she was ready to see it again. When he returned, Naomi was sitting on the porch steps in one of his old flannel shirts, wrapped in a blanket hair, still damp from a sponge bath she'd taken earlier. She didn't ask what he'd found. She just said, I want to write it all down. Everything I remember, before it fades or before someone makes me forget again. Micah nodded. There's a leather journal in the drawer next to the sink. Take it. She did. And from that moment on, Naomi began to reclaim herself one word at a time. Days passed, then a week. The dynamic between the three of them shifted without anyone noticing. Eli began leaving small gifts by her mug every morning, a feather, a stone, a wildflower pressed flat in a napkin. Naomi responded by reading to him from her journal, not her story, but pieces of it transformed into metaphors, stories of phoenixes that rose from tide pools and whales that sang through storms. Eli listened without blinking, as if the syllables filled a hollow he didn't know existed. Micah, meanwhile, repaired the roof, fortified the cellar, and set a new perimeter line behind the garden. He taught Naomi how to hold a revolver, how to recognize the crunch of dry pine needles under boots, how to disappear into tree-lined shadows if needed. Some storms, he told her, don't come with thunder. She understood. Then one afternoon, a car appeared at the end of the trail. Not Micah's truck, not a local. A sleek black SUV with tinted windows and out-of-place precision. Naomi saw it from the window and froze. Her fingers tightened on the fabric of her shirt. They found me. Micah didn't flinch. Stay inside, he said. He stepped out onto the porch as the driver emerged. Clean-cut, expensive suit, a smile too polished to be sincere. Good afternoon, the man called, voice calm. I'm looking for Naomi Blake. Just want to talk. She's not here, Micah said. And even if she were, she's not interested. Mr. Langston would prefer a quiet solution, the man said, undeterred. He's willing to offer financial security, private settlement, and no legal proceedings. All he asks is that Ms. Blake refrain from pursuing litigation or making statements that could harm his reputation. Micah's jaw clenched. You have 10 seconds to leave. You understand this could end poorly, the man said, for everyone. You're not the storm, Micah said coldly. You're just the wind before it, and I've weathered worse. The man left. But the message had been delivered. Naomi knew now it wouldn't stop. Not until someone made it stop. That night she sat by the fire, Grace asleep on her chest, Eli curled nearby with his notebook, and Micah carving driftwood in silence. She looked at the man who had dragged her from the sea and the boy who never said much but saw everything. I'm done hiding, she said. Micah nodded once. Then we fight smart. She smiled, weary but stronger. No. Then we fight like people with something worth protecting. Outside, the wind howled again, but this time it didn't shake the windows. And inside, the fire burned steadier than ever. The storm never came all at once. It arrived in whispers first, in the way Naomi began to stare out the window a little longer each morning, her fingers tracing invisible shapes on the fog glass as Grace dozed quietly against her chest, and Eli sketched silent worlds from a corner of the room. It came in the hesitant clink of the spoon against her teacup, in the letters that Micah retrieved from the town's post office box. Most of them junk, but occasionally one without a return address sealed too neatly to be casual. Naomi would read those alone at the table, her eyes moving but never softening. Garrett Langston had not just tried to kill her, he had tried to erase her, and failing that he was now attempting to repurpose her craft, a version of events that made her complicit, unstable, irrelevant. She had survived the sea, survived the betrayal, survived the delivery of a child, while thunder cracked overhead. But the hardest part wasn't survival. It was deciding to be seen again. And so, one quiet Wednesday wrapped in a navy blue sling, with Grace sleeping on her chest, Naomi stood before the courthouse clerk in Grayshore, a town too small for media and too wise to rumors, and handed over an envelope containing every file Micah had helped her protect, medical documents, dated photographs of bruises, sworn witness statements from a former maid who had fled Garrett's penthouse bank transactions, proving coercion, and a handwritten letter of her own firm, Clear and Final. "This isn't a revenge act," she said, when the clerk asked if she'd like police protection. "This is a record for my daughter. So, when she asks, I can say, I didn't disappear, I stood." The clerk, a woman in her 50s with graying hair, pulled into a sharp bun, simply nodded and took the envelope as though it weighed nothing, even though Naomi knew it contained the burden of 5 years of fear. Back at the cabin, the atmosphere changed, not louder, but deeper. Every gesture meant more. Eli built Grace a wooden cradle from reclaimed pine and carved her name into the side with an old soldering tool. Micah fixed the cracked porch step, reinforcing it 3 times, even though it held just fine, as if ensuring no one would stumble, not now, not here. Naomi, meanwhile, began writing again, not about Garrett or trauma, but about beginnings, about the feeling of a child's fingers curling around hers for the first time, the rhythm of sea foam sliding up to her boots, without warning the sound of Eli humming under his breath when he thought no one was listening. She wrote letters to Grace and tucked them into the back of a leather-bound journal Micah had given her beside wildflower petals, and a small feather Eli once laid beside her tea. There was beauty now, but they all knew it was borrowed time. Then one morning, as frost kissed the windows and a faint fog rolled off the sea, Micah opened the front door and froze. A parcel sat on the steps, neatly wrapped dry, despite the dew, with Naomi's name scrawled in a hand he recognized too well. Inside legal documents, an offer from Garrett's estate. It wasn't a settlement. It was a warning disguised as charity. He would offer her full financial security trust funds for Grace protection from ongoing embarrassment if she agreed to recant her claims and sign custody rights upon transition. Naomi read it once, then again, then slowly folded it back into the envelope. She didn't cry. Instead, she looked toward Grace's cradle, then at Micah. "He thinks legacy is something you write with ink and zeros," she said. "But I'm going to rewrite mine in firewood and lullabies." That evening she added a new letter to the journal, one that began not with anger, but with conviction. "To my daughter, you were not born to be bargained over. You were born of will, of survival, of choice. I will never sign you away." When Eli quietly handed her a drawing the next morning, Grace at 5, standing strong between 2 figures, one with a notebook, one with a hammer, Naomi placed a hand over her heart and whispered, "Then we fight for that future." From that moment, the cabin was no longer a refuge. It was a front line, a sanctuary turned fortress, and no storm, no signature, no suit in a tailored jacket could tear down what had been built, with hands blistered not from war, but from choosing to stay. Micah knew the trail well, the thin, barely visible path behind the garden that twisted through fir trees and ferns, leading to the long abandoned ranger station tucked into the hillside like a secret waiting to be remembered. He had shown Naomi once under a moonless sky, their boots sinking into moss and pine needles, flashlight beam bouncing between roots and rock, her breath steady but wary. "If I'm ever not here," he had told her, handing her a brass key with initials etched into its side, "you take Eli and Grace and you don't wait. This lock still works. There's heat. There's food. There's a shortwave radio on the 2nd floor." She hadn't asked how he knew all this. She didn't need to. Some people carried escape plans in their veins, like others carried hope. In the days that followed, Naomi practiced. She wore the baby in the sling, taught Eli to pack the emergency bag in under 4 minutes, kept a flashlight by the door, a hammer under her bed, and the key on a cord around her neck like a talisman. But despite the preparations, the days themselves passed gently. Grace began to smile. Eli began to talk more about the sea, about driftwood animals, about how he thought fireflies must be stars that got lost. Micah listened more than he spoke, but when he looked at Naomi now, it wasn't with the caution of a man sheltering a fugitive. It was the quiet gravity of someone who had seen a soul on the brink and chosen not to turn away. Naomi, for her part, no longer flinched at every sound. She read aloud again sometimes, even laughed the sound, hesitant at first, like testing the depth of a frozen pond, but eventually free and full. Then came the letter. Not in the mail, not from a courier. It arrived like a shadow placed on the windowsill during the night, inside an envelope so perfectly pressed it might have been folded by machine. No name, no address, just one line on the front, in a script that made Naomi's hands go cold. Blake. Inside one page typed formal, dripping in sanitized venom. Garrett Langston was no longer begging or bargaining, he was demanding. He acknowledged the misunderstanding surrounding Naomi's disappearance and offered a dignified path forward that involved shared custody with full corporate oversight, a non-disclosure clause, and the complete surrender of any criminal accusations in exchange for Naomi's silence and cooperation. The final sentence pierced deeper than any threat. If you decline this offer, be advised that I will pursue full custody and prove your instability in court, with evidence your recent companions cannot protect you from. Naomi didn't scream, didn't throw the letter. She read it, folded it, set it on the kitchen table. Then she walked to Grace's cradle and knelt beside it, brushing her fingers along the baby's cheek, as if anchoring herself in something he could never reach. He thinks I'm still the girl who says yes to survival and no to justice, she whispered. Micah leaned against the counter, arms crossed. He thinks he owns what he breaks. Eli stood silently nearby, holding a sketch he hadn't shown anyone yet. A small wooden house surrounded by tall trees, and in front of it, 3 silhouettes standing like sentinels. I think, Naomi said, slowly standing and looking at Micah directly. It's time I stopped answering with silence. The next day she made a phone call, not to the police, not to a lawyer, to a reporter she had once shared a college dorm with, now a rising investigative journalist known for exposing private sector corruption and abuse of power. Naomi didn't give her a story. She gave her a hard drive. It held everything: digital scans of Bruce's security footage from Garrett's penthouse elevator, voice recordings she'd managed to save from his threats, and even the yacht's departure log, showing only 2 passengers listed for that day, Garrett Langston and Naomi Blake. The woman on the other end of the line didn't promise protection. She promised truth. And sometimes, that was enough. 3 days later, Langston Enterprises' press team released a vague statement about personal matters involving Mr. Langston's estranged spouse. It was meant to preempt the story. It only fed it. The article dropped like a thunderclap. Headlines screamed, "Tech mogul accused of attempted murder in private yacht disappearance." But while the world stirred, the cabin remained still. No interviews, no camera crews. Naomi declined them all. I'm not a spectacle, she told Micah. I'm a mother. But Garrett didn't like being outmaneuvered. That night, a black car drove past the edge of their property twice. The next morning, the local store clerk told Micah 2 men in tailored coats had asked where he lived. By noon, Eli spotted a drone hovering near the bluff. Micah brought the emergency bag down from the attic. Naomi didn't panic. She packed. And that evening, with Grace nestled between them and Eli curled under a thick wool blanket on the floor, Naomi sat at the fireplace and said, I'm not running, not anymore, but I won't let him chase her. Micah nodded slowly. Then quietly he opened a drawer beneath the bookshelf and pulled out an old revolver wrapped in flannel. Naomi stared at it. I hate guns. So do I, Micah said. But hating a storm won't stop it. Boarding the windows might. She said nothing, but she took the gun. And when she placed it beside her journal that night, between ink and truth, it didn't feel like fear. It felt like preparation. Outside, the sea thrashed harder against the rocks. But inside, Naomi held her daughter like a shield and whispered, You were never meant to be his. You were always meant to be free. And far above the waves where pine branches danced in the cold coastal wind, A single paper lantern, Eli's handmade wish, floated upward, carrying only one word written in crooked pencil: home. The storm didn't wait for permission. It crashed into the coast just after midnight, with a voice that didn't ask to be heard. It demanded it. Wind howled like it was dragging ghosts through the pines, slamming against the cabin's roof, with fists of water and rage rattling every window, every memory not yet buried deep enough. Inside, the fire struggled against the violence outside its light, flickering across the walls like breath holding on. Micah stood at the front door, one hand pressed against the frame's shoulders, rigid, his eyes not watching the rain, but something deeper, watching time perhaps, or waiting for the past to announce itself. But what came instead was a cry sharp and raw from behind him. Naomi clutched the edge of the table, her knuckles white, eyes wide, breath staggered. The contraction hit like lightning and bent her nearly to her knees. "It's happening," she gasped, voice cracked open by pain and panic. Micah didn't flinch. He turned, steadied her, with both arms helped her to the couch. "How far apart?" he asked, already grabbing towels from the linen shelf and tossing them toward Eli, who had gone completely still for only a second, before moving into motion like someone who had rehearsed this in secret. 3, maybe 4 minutes, Naomi groaned. "It's too soon. We can't, yes we can." Micah interrupted, voice low, but full of steel. "We don't have time to argue with fate. You just breathe. I've got you. You've done this," she asked between clenched teeth. "Once, long time ago. Different woman, different reasons. Same storm," he said, laying towels beneath her as thunder cracked so loud it shook the glass. Eli moved with the calm of someone who understood that fear was not the enemy, hesitation was. He set out the flashlight, fetched the emergency medical kit, brought water and a clean knife Micah had sterilized years ago, for a moment he hoped would never come. Naomi's screams weren't wild. They were controlled, guttural, the sounds of a woman fighting not just pain, but memory. "I can't do this," she gasped as the next contraction hit. "He's still out there. He'll find her. I can't. He won't," Micah said, brushing the wet hair from her forehead, with hands that had once only known how to build boats, but now remembered how to hold life. "You're not alone. I'm here. We're here. And this is yours, not his." Outside, the sea raged like it was mourning or celebrating or both. Inside, Naomi gripped Eli's hand with such force the boy winced but didn't pull away. "You're doing it," he whispered. "She's coming." And then, a moment later, she was. A scream. A breath. A silence so full it swallowed the storm. Then the tiniest cry, high, piercing, defiant. Micah caught the child in trembling hands, wrapped her in the flannel towel Eli had laid out, and stared into eyes that hadn't even opened yet, but somehow still saw him. "She's perfect," he whispered, voice breaking for the first time in years. Naomi sobbed, not from pain now, but from the unbearable lightness of relief. Micah placed the baby on her chest, and in that second time, fractured. The storm disappeared. The fire stopped crackling. The air thickened with something ancient and holy. Naomi looked at her daughter's face, so small, so fierce, and whispered one word: grace. Not just a name, but a vow, a statement to the universe that no man, no ocean, no power hungry enough to kill would ever define this child. She had survived the sea before she breathed. She had been born in thunder, but named in peace. Eli sat down slowly beside them, eyes wide, cheeks wet, not even realizing he was crying, until Naomi reached out, touched his hair, and said, "You're her big brother now." And the boy, who had never asked for anything, never claimed any space but the corners of rooms and the silence between other people's words, nodded once. "I'll protect her," he said, "always." That night, as the storm slowly receded and the first stars emerged like shy witnesses behind thinning clouds, Micah stepped outside and looked at the sea. It no longer looked angry. It looked spent. The waves rolled in softer, almost apologetic. He breathed in the salt, the pine, the smoke from the chimney, and something else, something like destiny folding back on itself. Behind him, Naomi held Grace with both arms, eyes closed, body wrecked, but triumphant. Eli slept on the floor nearby, curled like a comma, at the end of a sentence none of them had known how to write until now. Micah whispered into the wind, "You brought her here. But I'm the one who's keeping her now." And the ocean in its endless motion didn't answer. It didn't need to. It had delivered its miracle, and it had been received. Morning arrived not in brightness but in softness, a hush that settled over the cabin like the last note of a lullaby still hanging in the air, the kind of quiet that follows not peace but triumph. The storm had passed, leaving behind glistening pine needles, dew-wet soil, and a sky so blue it felt like forgiveness. Inside the cabin, Naomi sat in the rocking chair Micah had sanded smooth months ago, without knowing who would one day fill it. Grace lay asleep in her arms, swaddled in flannel and warmth, her tiny chest rising and falling like a tide Micah no longer feared. Naomi's body ached, her skin still tender, but her eyes were clear for the first time in years. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was grounded as if giving birth had poured something back into her that Garrett had tried to drain identity agency, something primal. Micah watched her from the kitchen, stirring oatmeal absent-mindedly. Not because he needed to cook, but because he didn't yet know what to say to a woman who had just delivered her child with thunder in her lungs and a vow in her throat. Eli moved around the room with quiet purpose, bringing Naomi a cup of tea, adding another log to the fire, sketching a new drawing near the window. And for a while, nothing happened. No drama, no threats, just the ordinary miracle of healing. But peace doesn't last forever, not when the world outside still thinks it owns your story. It arrived in a padded envelope left at the foot of the porch. Before sunrise, no footsteps, no vehicles seen, just presence like a ghost in designer shoes. Micah found it first, and when he read the name across the front, Naomi Blake, his jaw tightened. He didn't open it. He brought it inside, set it on the kitchen table, and waited. Naomi saw it the moment she entered the room. She didn't flinch. She walked to the table, picked it up, and slid her finger under the seal with a precision that said she'd opened wounds deeper than this. Inside was a single typed letter, no salutation, no warmth, no remorse. It was from Garrett. Not handwritten, not emotional, just legal and calculated, wrapped in the sterile confidence of a man who still believed power was currency and control was his right. He acknowledged the press coverage claimed it was unfounded and threatened to countersue if she didn't retract her accusations. But then came the twist. He offered Grace an inheritance. Not for Naomi, not as a plea, but as leverage. The child you birthed while biologically mine need not suffer the consequences of your instability, the letter read. Return voluntarily, and I will ensure her future remains intact. Decline, and I will pursue full custody with the legal force you know I possess. Naomi didn't cry. She didn't tear the letter, didn't scream. She simply folded it and placed it on the counter beside the stove, next to a bag of wild rice and a jar of honey. Then she looked at Micah, who had said nothing, his eyes fixed on her with the weight of someone ready to lift something he didn't even know the shape of yet. He's bluffing, she said finally, her voice even. He's reaching. And men like him only reach when they feel control slipping. You sure you want to do what's next? Micah asked. Because once it starts, it doesn't stop. Naomi nodded slowly, eyes still burning, but calm. I've already started. Now I finish. That afternoon, she asked for the lockbox Micah had kept hidden behind the bookshelf, steel-dented heavy with years. Inside were the files she'd entrusted to him, the ones she hadn't dared read in months. But she did now. Photos, financial records, handwritten notes from doctors, medical intake forms, audio files from late-night voicemails. Garrett never thought anyone would save. It was all still there, all real. She laid them out like evidence in a courtroom, only she could see, and Eli watched from the doorway, his fingers running along the grain of the wooden wall, not speaking, not asking, just witnessing. Naomi turned to him. You know what it's like, don't you? When someone bigger than you decides your world for you. Eli didn't reply. He just walked over and handed her a drawing. A little girl, Grace older now, maybe 6 or 7, standing on a cliff, her arms open to the wind. Behind her were 2 silhouettes, one with a hammer, one with a notebook. She'll have us, Eli said. Naomi stared at the picture for a long moment. Then she smiled, not with joy, not even with pride, but with certainty. That evening she sat at the kitchen table with Micah and spread everything out. We don't go to war, she said. We build something bigger. We take his money, his name, and we reframe it. Not for him, for her. What are you thinking? Micah asked. A foundation, she said. A safe haven. A real legacy. Harbor of light. For women who fled what I fled. For kids like Eli. For people who need to know storms don't get to write the ending. Micah nodded. Then let's build it. Naomi reached for his hand, fingers brushing his for the first time in weeks. Not accidental, not just grateful anchoring. I only ever wanted to be free, she said. Now I want to free others. And as the sun dipped low behind the sea, casting the cabin in gold and fire, Grace stirred in her cradle and let out a cry, not from fear, but from arrival. Naomi walked over, picked her up, and whispered, "You're not his, you're not mine, you're your own. But you will know the truth, and you will never be alone." Outside, the wind rose again, but this time it felt like applause. There was something sacred about the way the cabin shifted that week. No longer just shelter, no longer a place to hide, but a forge where intention melted. Fear where truth was no longer whispered, but carved into existence. Naomi spent her mornings drafting the Foundation's charter, its name echoing through her every line, Harbor of Light. It wasn't just for Grace anymore. It was for every woman who had ever been silenced with money, every mother told that love was weakness, every child made to grow up in the shadows of broken men. Micah built the structure around her vision, the only way he knew how, with quiet, with wood, with presence. He reinforced the porch railing, tightened the hinges on the cabin's front door, made sure every lock turned smooth and silent. His hands knew how to steady things, even when the world refused to. Grace grew stronger, louder. She began to respond to Naomi's voice, to Eli's humming, to the rhythm of a place that had learned how to love without fanfare. Eli began teaching her simple shapes, lifting them in front of her, like offerings triangle, circle, heart. Naomi began smiling without thinking, but the peace was never delusion. It was defiance. One morning, Micah returned from town slower than usual, his truck dusted with pollen, windshields streaked with river mud. Naomi met him on the porch, Grace asleep in the sling across her chest, Eli sitting nearby with a wooden puzzle half finished in his lap. "You're late," she said with a trace of humor, but Micah didn't smile. He reached into the glove box and pulled out a thin manila envelope closed with a wax seal. He handed it to her, wordlessly. Naomi took it with both hands and walked inside, laying Grace down gently before peeling the seal away. Inside, a notice from Garrett's legal team marked confidential. The ink was clean, the words were not. Garrett Langston had filed for full legal custody in a court 3 states away, claiming Naomi had kidnapped the child, suffered from postpartum psychosis, and posed a danger to the child's well-being. The allegations weren't just false, they were engineered, sculpted like weapons, backed by affidavits from doctors Naomi had never met, and signed declarations from people she hadn't spoken to in years. "He's rewriting me," she said quietly. "Not just our story, me." Micah read the pages over her shoulder, jaw clenching tighter with every line. "He wants you to fight a ghost version of yourself, so he never has to face the real one. And the worst part is Naomi whispered he almost convinced me I was her." Silence hung between them like smoke. Then Eli's voice, soft, certain, rose from the corner. "You're not her." She didn't fight back. Naomi looked at the boy, and something inside her straightened. That night, as the wind died and the fire rose, Naomi stood in the middle of the cabin, holding her journal in one hand, Garrett's legal notice in the other. She tore the latter in half, slowly, then again, then dropped the pieces into the flames and watched them curl into ash. "He may own the court," she said, "but I own my name." And so, they planned. Micah contacted a friend from his old life, Mary Ann Klein, an independent legal advocate who'd once built her career exposing abuse inside custody courts. She arrived 3 days later, boots caked with mountain dust, briefcase scuffed at the corners, eyes sharp enough to cut through glass. She shook Naomi's hand like they'd already won. "We don't let him control the narrative," Mary Ann said. "We tell our own. We show receipts. We bring truth. But first we go public." Naomi hesitated. "That means giving them everything, even the pain." "Pain is proof," Mary Ann said. "You survived it. You own it. Don't let him weaponize what you lived through." That evening, Naomi sat on the porch and wrote a letter, not to Garrett, not to the court, but to the public. In it, she told the story plainly. Not as a victim, but as a woman who had once loved a man who used control as currency, silence as strategy. She described the yacht, the shove, the water. She described waking up on the Oregon shore to a stranger who became a safe place. She described Grace how the name wasn't a soft word, but a blade she had forged in salt and fire. The letter went live the next morning. By nightfall, it had reached over 2 million people. By the end of the week, the internet had done what no court dared. It made Garrett Langston a cautionary tale. News outlets followed, blogs reposted. A grassroots movement formed. Survivors wrote letters. Donors sent money. Harbor of Light was no longer an idea, it was a rising tide. And then came the call, Garrett himself, not through lawyers, not through proxies. Naomi answered on speaker with Micah and Marianne, beside her, Grace nursing in the next room, Eli sketching in silence by the fire. His voice was calm, rehearsed, still lined with the false politeness of the boardrooms and depositions. "Naomi," he said, "you've made quite the mess." "No," she replied. "You did. I just stopped cleaning it for you. You think this ends with an Article A foundation? The court will side with me. Then I guess we'll see you there." "Don't be foolish, Garrett," hissed the veneer, cracking. "I will bury you in litigation. Your little shack, your cabal of witnesses, it won't matter. You pushed a pregnant woman into the ocean," she said. "You lost the right to matter. You think you're safe?" he snarled. "You think some washed-up boat builder and a mute child are going to keep you warm at night?" "They already have," she said, then hung up. And for the first time since that terrible night on the yacht, she felt something close to clean. Micah reached over, took her hand, and didn't let go. Grace slept soundly. Eli looked up from his sketch, Naomi standing with fire behind her, Grace in her arms, and Micah and Eli beside her like anchors made of flesh and history. This, Naomi said, her voice clear, as moonlight on still water, is where his empire ends. And mine begins. They arrived at the Grayshore County Courthouse just after sunrise when the air was still crisp with pine and salt, and the parking lot hadn't yet filled with whispers. Naomi stepped out of the truck, not like a woman being dragged into litigation, but like a tide that had turned in its own time, steady and unstoppable. She wore a charcoal gray dress, not for beauty, not for show, but for armor. And her hands didn't shake as she adjusted the sling where Grace rested against her chest, swaddled in navy wool and heartbeat. Micah walked beside her in silence, boots firm against the pavement, his presence wide enough to keep unwanted stares at bay. Eli held her hand, his other arm wrapped around a worn sketchbook he never left behind. And though no one asked why a boy should be there, something in his eyes said, "Because I lived it too." Inside the courtroom smelled of paper coffee and polished thread. Garrett was already seated at the plaintiff's table, dressed like the world still bowed when he entered a room, his jaw-tight hair perfect, surrounded by two attorneys who looked as if they had never known the weight of a consequence. He didn't look at Naomi right away, but when he did, his face changed not into regret, not into shame, but into calculation, like someone watching a familiar chessboard, only to realize the pieces had moved without him. Naomi took her seat beside Marianne, who wore a blouse the color of ash and a grin sharp enough to cut through red tape. The judge entered an older woman with iron gray hair and eyes that didn't blink more than necessary. The session began. Garrett's lawyers led with performance, claiming Naomi had fled. The marital estate had denied Mr. Langston reasonable access to his biological child, had refused multiple offers of mediation. They referenced outdated mental health reports, a neighbor's vague statement, and even an attempt to use the time Naomi spent in seclusion as evidence of unfitness. They never said trauma. They never said survival. They said damage. They said emotional volatility. Naomi didn't interrupt. She sat with her back straight, her face, still one hand on Grace's back, as the baby slept through the sound of her future being debated like property. Then it was Marianne's turn. She didn't posture. She didn't pace. She simply stood turned on the monitor and played a recording. Garrett's voice grainy but unmistakably venomous. "No one will believe you. You're just a body that got lucky with my name." Gasps broke from the gallery. Even the judge tilted forward. Then came the documents, hospital reports with broken rib x-rays, financial transfers made in Naomi's name, without consent, an audio clip from the yacht's intercom system. Garrett's voice faintly yelling, "Shut up and jump, or I'll do it for you." Garrett's face twitched, but his lawyers froze. The judge didn't speak for a moment. Then she said, "Ms. Blake, you may speak." Naomi stood. She didn't read from a statement. She didn't need to. "I'm not here to win," she said. "I'm here to end it. For 5 years I was quiet so he could stay comfortable. I survived water silence and being told that motherhood makes me weak. But what I learned on a beach in Oregon is that being broken isn't the same as being gone. My daughter isn't leverage. She's legacy. And if she ever asks me why I stood up here, I'll tell her because you deserve to see your mother fight for you with everything she has left." Silence followed, not the stunned kind, but the respectful kind, the kind that lets a woman's truth settle in the floorboards. The judge took a breath and said she would review everything before ruling, but her eyes had already decided. After court, Garrett tried to approach Naomi in the hallway, but Micah stepped in front of her, and for the first time in their entire entanglement, Garrett hesitated. Maybe it was the look in Micah's eyes. Maybe it was the quiet fire in Eli's stare. Or maybe for the first time Garrett saw what Naomi had become, without him. A woman who didn't just survive him, but rendered him irrelevant. Naomi didn't speak. She didn't gloat. She simply lifted Grace higher in her arms, and walked out the courthouse doors into a wind that smelled not of fear, but of cedar and rain. That evening back at the cabin, they didn't celebrate. They just gathered. Micah made stew. Eli built a new mobile for Grace, each wooden star painted in earth tones. Naomi sat by the fire and wrote one more letter for the journal, addressed not to Grace this time, but to herself. You didn't disappear. You were just waiting for a place to be whole. And now, you've made one. Grace babbled in her cradle. Eli laughed at a joke Micah didn't even finish, and Naomi looked at the flicker of flames against the cabin wall and whispered, "We are not done. We're just getting started." The weeks that followed did not feel like a victory parade. They felt like breath returning to lungs too used to holding it, like bruises fading, not into forgetfulness, but into memory without pain. The ruling came quietly in the form of an email from the court clerk, short and clear, full custody, granted to Naomi Blake, sole parental rights, no visitation. Garrett Langston's appeal was denied. The court found his pattern of coercion abuse and reputational manipulation to be in direct contradiction to the child's best interest. And that phrase, the child's best interest, made Naomi cry not out of grief, but because someone finally said out loud what she had known. From the moment she felt Grace kick beneath her ribs, this little girl deserved safety, and Naomi had given it to her not by running, but by staying by standing. Micah read the ruling in silence, his face unreadable, then folded the paper and tucked it between the pages of Naomi's journal as if it were not just a legal win, but a page in their collective history. Eli made tea stronger than usual and handed it to Naomi without speaking, his fingers lingering just a second longer on the cup. That night they lit a lantern on the porch, not in celebration, but in recognition. Grace had a future, and for the first time that future didn't include the shadow of Garrett Langston's reach. But just as relief settled, the past knocked one last time, this time not with threats, but with a gift so sharp it almost drew blood. It arrived in a legal packet from Garrett's estate, not sent from a lawyer, but hand-delivered to Grayshore's town clerk by a private courier who asked for no signature. Inside was a statement signed by Garrett himself, dated just 3 days before, the ruling declaring that upon his death, whenever it came, his personal assets would bypass any corporate structure and be left entirely to Grace Langston, including a 49% controlling share in Langston Enterprises' real estate holdings, and a portfolio valued in excess of $180 million. There was no letter of apology, no explanation, just clean documentation, notarized and final. Naomi stared at the pages for a long time, her hand resting over her daughter's head as Grace cooed in her lap. She didn't want it. Not the money, not the empire, not the name. But she also knew that rejecting it meant letting his version of legacy stand uncontested. So that night by the fire, with Eli sketching nearby and Micah sanding a wooden cradle for Grace's next growth spurt, Naomi said something that changed the shape of everything. What if we accept it, but repurpose it? Micah looked up, brow furrowed. Turn blood money into shelter, she said. Turn his apology into protection. Take the weight of his guilt and hammer it into something clean. You don't want her tied to his empire, Micah said. I don't, Naomi replied, but I want her to know she was strong enough to hold it and choose something better. Eli looked up from his sketch, then stood, walked over and showed Naomi what he had drawn. It was the same cabin, but brighter. A line of children's shoes on the porch, a sign above the door, Harbor of Light Foundation. Naomi smiled through tears. Then we start there. Over the next month, things moved faster than Naomi expected. Marianne connected them with legal teams who specialized in foundation law in restructuring estates for social impact. Naomi refused the board seat, the Aspen mansion, the private plane. She accepted only what could be transformed. And slowly Langston Enterprises began to change, not because Garrett wanted it, but because Grace, through Naomi, reclaimed it. A new charter was filed. Harbor of Light became not just an idea, but a registered nonprofit fully funded independent focused on three things: transitional housing for single parents, fleeing domestic abuse, trauma, informed child care, and creative development programs for neurodivergent children like Eli, who had never needed fixing, only room to bloom. The press picked up the story, not with scandal this time, but awe. Abuse survivor turns inherited fortune into refuge for others. But Naomi didn't speak to the media. She stayed in the cabin, wrote letters to Grace for the journal, watched Micah build a new wing to the house, a reading nook with tall windows, and helped Eli design the floor plan for a community center in town. One morning, while rocking Grace beneath the old pine tree out back, Naomi whispered, "You were never a secret. You were the spark." That same evening, Finn, who had once only drawn in silence, handed her a carved plaque made of driftwood. Burned into the grain were 6 words. This is where Grace begins again. Naomi hung it above the front door. It wasn't flashy, but it was the truth. And truth, she had learned, was the most permanent kind of legacy. The seasons began to shift like old stories folding into new pages, and with them the land around the cabin transformed, not wildly, not all at once, but with the quiet determination of roots that had decided to stay. By October, the trees along the bluff glowed gold and rust leaves, scattering like blessings over the trail that led from the cabin to the water's edge. Naomi stood on the porch one morning, coffee warm in her hands, watching as Micah helped Eli stack firewood into even rows, Grace strapped to her chest in a worn sling, cooing softly, tugging at the edge of her father's flannel collar. Yes, father. It hadn't been spoken aloud, not officially, not notarized, but it had been lived in the spaces between gestures, in the way Micah rose without complaint at 3 a.m. When Grace cried, in the way he carried her on his shoulders, when Naomi's arms were tired, in the way Grace reached for him first now, when the wind startled the trees. That kind of fatherhood wasn't claimed by blood or ink. It was earned in firelight and patience. And Naomi, once afraid of dependence, now allowed herself to lean gently when she needed to, not out of weakness, but trust. Eli had changed too. His sketches, once sharp with shadows and lone figures, were now full of movement. Children dancing, hands touching homes with open windows. He had begun speaking more during meals, laughing at Micah's dry jokes, even helping Naomi catalog incoming donations for the Harbor of Light Satellite Center, being renovated just 3 miles inland. What had once been Langston's abandoned guest estate was now being turned into transitional housing, and Naomi walked through those rooms with blueprints in hand, imagining bunk beds instead of marble bars, storybooks instead of designer lamps. "We're not erasing what he built," she once told Marianne over the phone. "We're correcting what it cost." That idea, correction as redemption, became the soul of the foundation. Grace, now 5 months old, began to sit up on her own, her laughter sudden and full-bodied, like her joy hadn't yet learned restraint. She became a symbol, not in some public branding way, but in the deeper sense, a symbol of what survives when cruelty fails. People started calling Naomi the silent founder, the survivor philanthropist, but she always corrected them gently. "I'm just a mother who got tired of running," she'd say, and built a lighthouse instead. The cabin, once their entire world, now became their anchor point, a retreat, a place to return to. It was where Grace took her first bite of mashed blueberries, where Eli read his first story aloud, without pausing, where Micah finally took Naomi's hand one evening by the fire and said, "You changed everything. And not because you fought him, but because you never let him decide who you were." She didn't reply. She just leaned her head against his shoulder, the sound of Grace's babbling in the background, like music made of light. That night, Naomi added a final line to her journal entry. "When you stop hiding, the world either has to make room or get out of your way." And just as she closed the journal, a knock came at the door, not threatening, gentle. A woman stood there, nervous, holding a child close to her chest, her eyes wild with the exhaustion Naomi recognized instantly. I don't know if I'm in the right place," the woman stammered, "but someone told me you help people who've been through things." Naomi didn't hesitate. She stepped aside, opened the door wider. "You're in the exact right place," she said. "Come in. The fire's warm, and we've got time." And as the woman stepped over the threshold, shoulders still trembling, but hope beginning to flicker in her eyes, Grace let out a single soft giggle from her playmat on the floor, as if welcoming the next chapter, the next survivor, the next heartbeat ready to be heard, winter whispered in slowly. That year not with fury but with a hush, wrapping the Oregon coast in low fog silver frost and a kind of stillness that made time feel deeper. The garden slept beneath a blanket of pine needles, the sea grew heavier in its rhythm, and the trails leading to the bluff became laced with ice that crunched beneath boots like distant echoes. Inside the cabin, warmth thrived not just from the fireplace that crackled with cedar and oak, but from the lives that had taken root within its walls. Grace, now nearly crawling, had turned the woven rug near the hearth into her kingdom, squealing with delight every time Micah scooped her up like a plane and flew her through the air, his deep laugh rising above the wind. Naomi watched them sometimes, without speaking, her eyes soft, but knowing like someone who'd wandered the wilderness long enough to recognize safety not as silence, but as the sound of home being lived in. Eli had found his rhythm too, spending his afternoons in the small loft that Micah had built above the kitchen, his art studio lit by a skylight that poured in morning gold. He started a new project, a large wooden installation made from driftwood and copper wiring shaped like a lighthouse. But inside it, he etched names not of donors or politicians, but of the women who had come to the retreat center, whose lives had been redirected, not rescued. Each name was burned in by hand, and under each he carved a single word they had chosen for themselves: light fighter mom, rebuild enough. Naomi added them to a quiet list she kept tucked between the last pages of her journal. They weren't statistics, they were blueprints of rebirth, and the center itself, now nearing its final stage of transformation, had begun to breathe with life. Volunteers arrived, weekly plumbers who gave time instead of invoices, retired teachers who painted walls in pastel murals, therapists who offered free sessions in rooms that once held cocktail bars and gold-frame vanity mirrors. The old estate was no longer a symbol of Garrett's excess. It had become a haven of Grace's inheritance, built from the ashes of a name that once threatened to define them. But it wasn't just strangers who found them now. Word had reached further. On a Sunday morning, as snow threatened to fall, for the first time a letter arrived addressed only to the founder. Inside was a photograph, grainy, faded. It was of Naomi from college, smiling, arms around two other women on a campus bench. And beneath it, a note: I saw your story. I never told mine. You reminded me I still can. There was no return address, but Naomi didn't need one. She placed the photo inside her journal with a kind of reverence that made the act feel sacred. That same day, a young girl arrived at the center with her mother. No luggage, no plan, just a plastic grocery bag of clothes, and a look in her eyes that mirrored Naomi's reflection from a year ago. Eli met them at the door, not with formality, but with grace. This way, he said gently, "We'll get you warm." Naomi didn't rush over. She waited, gave space. Then, as the sun dipped behind the bluff and the sky turned to a wash of lavender and steel, she stepped onto the porch where the girl sat, wrapped in one of Micah's old wool blankets. "You okay?" she asked. The girl nodded but didn't speak. "You don't have to talk today," Naomi said, "but whenever you want to, someone here will listen." After a pause, the girl looked up, voice barely above wind. "What if I'm broken?" Naomi crouched down slowly, her breath steady. "So were we," she said. "That's why we know how to build." The girl didn't smile, not yet, but she didn't look away either, and Naomi took that as a beginning. That night, with snow beginning to fall and the fireplace glowing low, Naomi, Micah, Eli, and Grace sat at the table together, their table not as survivors of one man's storm, but as architects of 1,000 safe harbors. Grace reached for the spoon in Naomi's hand and banged it joyfully against the wooden table. Micah smirked. Eli rolled his eyes playfully. Naomi laughed a full laugh, the kind that came from somewhere no grief could ever touch again. And on the wall above them, the driftwood plaque read what they had all come to believe with their whole selves: "This is where Grace lives." Spring arrived without asking for permission, soft as breath, bold as rebirth. The coastal trees budded with new green, and wildflowers pushed defiantly through soil once hardened by frost, as if the earth itself was echoing the truth that had taken root inside Naomi. Survival was never the end, only the beginning. The harbor of Light Retreat opened its doors with no ribbon cutting, no speeches, just a handwritten sign on the gate that read, "Come as you are." By then, over a dozen families had passed through its warmth, each leaving behind a trace of crayon drawing on the bulletin board, a name scrawled in Eli's lighthouse, a lullaby added to the shared bedtime playlist that now looped gently through the halls every evening. Naomi walked those halls not as a savior, not as a founder, but as someone who knew what it meant to be seen when you expected to disappear. Grace now wobbling on her feet with arms outstretched like wings. Too new to know fear had become the soul of the place, toddling from lap to lap, her laugh so full it made people cry. She didn't know the details of her origin yet, but she didn't need to, not yet. She only needed to know that the world could be kind, that hands could be safe, that home was not a structure, but a choice repeated daily. Micah had proposed in the most Micah way possible, not with fireworks, not with a grand gesture, but by sliding a carved wooden ring box across the kitchen table one foggy morning, while Grace gnawed on toast and Eli poured tea like a monk. Naomi opened it in silence, saw the band's symbol etched with waves and 3 stars, and looked up with tears already forming. Yes, she whispered before he even asked. Their wedding was held beneath the old pine on the bluff, barefoot in the moss, with Grace in Eli's arms, and a circle of people who had once been strangers, now family. Naomi didn't wear white. She wore the same gray dress she had worn to court because she wanted the world to see that strength could be beautiful too. That same week, a letter arrived not from Garrett, who had since vanished from headlines and retreated into legal silence, but from his sister, someone Naomi hadn't spoken to in years. It was short. Whatever my brother tried to erase, you brought back. I hope Grace never carries his name, but I hope she inherits your fire. Naomi tucked it inside the journal, along with her vows, Grace's first scribble, and a copy of the court ruling, because history, even when painful, deserved to be kept by those who reclaimed it. Years passed, and the seasons kept folding forward. Grace grew tall, wild, brilliant with Naomi's eyes and Micah's steadiness. Eli became a teacher, then an artist in residence at the foundation, his lighthouse sculpture replicated in 4 more retreat centers across the country. One evening, when the wind returned to the coast and the sea sounded just like it had that first night, Naomi walked down to the shoreline alone, barefoot in the sand, holding a seashell locket around her neck, the same one Micah had found tangled in her hair all those years ago. She opened it, inside a photo of baby Grace, and tucked behind it a single dried sprig of lavender. She looked out at the horizon, where sky kissed sea, and whispered, "You didn't win." Not to Garrett. Not even to the past, but to the version of herself that once thought survival was the best she could hope for. She turned to walk back toward the cabin, its windows glowing in the dusk like small galaxies. From the porch, Grace waved. Eli lit the lantern. Micah opened the door, and Naomi smiled fully, deeply, finally. Because where the tide once tried to take everything from her, she now gave it back to the world, rebuilt, renamed, and wrapped in the quiet power of a woman who chose to live. Not just for herself, but for every soul still waiting to come ashore. In a world that tried to silence her, she spoke with her life. In a court built for power, she walked in as a mother and walked out as a movement. Where a man once pushed her into the sea, she built a foundation to rescue others from drowning. Grace was not just her daughter, she was the proof that light can grow from shipwrecks. And now, where the tide once threatened to take everything, Naomi stands firm, with a home that holds others, with a voice that cannot be erased, and with a legacy that was never written in money, but in firelight and laughter and in doors opened wide. If this story moved, you let us know where you're watching from, and share it with someone who needs to remember your past is not your prison. It might just be your purpose. Subscribe for more stories like this, because we're building something real here, one miracle at a time.